You could say my parents were financially irresponsible, but that would be putting it mildly. They had turned spending money they didn't have into an art form, the kind that should have earned them an exhibition in a museum dedicated to poor life choices. They didn't just live beyond their means, they set up camp there, built a mansion with an infinity pool, and threw parties every weekend as if overdraft fees didn't exist. My mother, in particular, had a talent for making poverty look glamorous. She had this way of draping a silk scarf over a dress bought on credit and sipping cheap wine from a crystal glass like she was some European aristocrat who had momentarily misplaced her family fortune. My father was her perfect accomplice, the kind of man who could justify buying a brand new car while still owing money on the last one because you have to look successful to become successful. Their entire philosophy revolved around the idea that if you pretend to be rich long enough, the universe will eventually get the hint and make it true. Spoiler, it didn't. The only person who ever dared to challenge this madness was my grandmother, my mom's mother, and quite possibly the last living expert on financial responsibility in our bloodline. She was the kind of woman who reused wrapping paper, counted her grocery receipts twice, and carried a neatly folded $20 bill in her wallet for emergencies, which, as far as I could tell, meant anything from a sudden need for milk to an unexpected nuclear apocalypse. "You mark my words, Maria," she'd say, shaking her head every time she saw my mother parade around in another designer outfit bought on a credit card she hadn't paid off in years. "One day, their luck will run out, and they'll be left with nothing but debts and bad taste." She wasn't wrong. Despite her constant warnings, my parents treated money like a mythical concept, something they could worry about later, much later, preferably when someone else was forced to deal with it. They took out loans for vacations they couldn't afford, bought furniture that looked expensive but fell apart within a year, and convinced themselves that buying name-brand groceries instead of store brands was a form of self-respect. Meanwhile, I grew up in a strange paradox. On the one hand, I lived in a house filled with expensive-looking things. On the other, I knew better than to ask for something as basic as new school shoes without preparing a full PowerPoint presentation on why they were an essential investment. My mother, who thought nothing of spending a small fortune on a dinner party to impress her equally broke friends, would look at me in horror if I asked for anything unnecessary like, say, a new winter coat. "Maria," she'd sigh dramatically, as if I had asked her to buy me a yacht. "Do you know how much money I already spend on you? Do you think money grows on trees?" I didn't. But I was starting to suspect she did. Through all of this, my grandmother remained my one island of financial sanity. She was the only person who ever taught me about saving, about thinking ahead, about not blowing every paycheck the second it arrived. "Money isn't just numbers in a bank account," she'd say. "It's choices. And if you don't make the right ones, someone else will make them for you." At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. But soon enough, I would. I should have known something was off when my parents started treating me like a VIP client instead of their daughter. They were suddenly all smiles, offering me tea, asking about my day with an almost uncomfortable level of enthusiasm, and, most suspiciously of all, calling me by my full name instead of the usual dismissive Masha. "Maria, sweetheart," my mother purred one evening, perching herself on the arm of the sofa like a cat that was about to demand something expensive. "Your father and I have been thinking. We should invest your inheritance wisely." I paused mid-sip of my tea. "We?" My father, already nodding enthusiastically, leaned forward. "It's not just money, honey. It's an opportunity. A house. A place for all of us, something solid, something lasting." Ah. There it was. I had barely received my inheritance when my parents started talking about family investments and smart decisions. By which, of course, they meant that I should hand over my money so they could play real estate moguls. "Imagine it," my mother continued dreamily. "A beautiful home, something classic but modern, big enough for all of us. You wouldn't want to waste your money on silly things, would you?" I had no plans to waste my money, actually. In fact, I had barely even touched it. But I had a feeling that my definition of waste and my parents' definition of waste were two very different things. I don't know. I hesitated, which was a mistake, because hesitation in my family was the same as surrender. "We've already found a place," my father exclaimed, as if I had just enthusiastically agreed. "We did all the research," my mother added. I highly doubted that. The last time my mother did research, it was to figure out how to refinance a loan without actually paying anything back. The next thing I knew, I was being driven to see a house they had already picked out. It was big, of course, bigger than necessary, and looked like something they'd seen in a reality show about rich people with poor taste. It had tall windows, a fancy gate, and a price tag that made my stomach hurt. "It's perfect, isn't it?" my mother sighed, gripping my arm like I was a contestant on a game show who was about to win the grand prize. It was, in fact, not perfect. It was expensive. Too expensive. And it screamed money pit with its oversized chandeliers and the suspiciously peeling paint near the back door. I don't know. I tried again, but my father was already talking to the real estate agent as if he were the one paying for it. And just like that, I was the proud, reluctant owner of a house that I hadn't even wanted. At first, I told myself it wasn't so bad. I mean, technically, it was mine, right? I was on the papers, I had the keys, and in theory, this was an investment for my future. But that illusion lasted about 5 minutes. First, my parents moved in as if it were their own. They picked the biggest bedroom, redecorated everything without asking me, and suddenly started referring to it as the family home. The second red flag? I noticed that whenever they had guests over, they would proudly show them around and say things like, "We bought this place," or "Our home is just perfect, isn't it?" Not "Maria bought this place." Not our daughter, who actually paid for it. Just we. I was slowly being erased. And then came the final blow. One day, after noticing some strange mail in the kitchen, I casually looked through a pile of documents my mother had left out. And that's when I saw it. My name was no longer on the ownership papers. I've always thought of betrayal as something dramatic, something involving secret affairs, stolen fortunes, and gasps of horror in the rain. What I hadn't considered was that sometimes betrayal can happen quietly, in broad daylight, disguised as casual conversations and harmless signatures on pieces of paper you don't read closely enough. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the documents I had just found. My name was gone. Vanished. As if it had never been there in the first place. At first, my brain refused to process what I was looking at. Surely, there was some mistake. A typo. A mix-up. Some kind of clerical error. I turned to my mother, who was humming cheerfully as she scrolled through her phone, entirely unbothered by the fact that she had just erased me from the biggest purchase of my life. "Mom," I said slowly, holding up the papers. "Why is my name not on the house deed?" She barely looked up. "Oh, that. Well, sweetheart, we had to make some adjustments." Adjustments. Like I was a misplaced piece of furniture, not the actual owner of the house. What kind of adjustments? My voice was unnervingly calm, considering the fact that my entire financial security had just been legally stripped from me. She sighed, as if I were the one being difficult. "It's just paperwork, Maria. You don't understand how these things work. Your father and I spoke to some people, and it made more sense to put the house under our names." Made more sense to whom? Because it sure as hell didn't make sense to me. I turned to my father, who was suddenly very interested in his coffee. "Dad?" "Listen, sweetheart," he said, in the same tone he used whenever he was about to justify something absolutely insane. "You're young. You don't need all that financial responsibility on your shoulders. This way, everything is taken care of. No stress for you. Right. No stress for me. Just the tiny inconvenience of having my own house stolen from under me. And the loan? I asked, my stomach already tightening with dread. They hesitated. A little too long. There may have been a small mortgage, my mother finally admitted, still not meeting my eyes. But nothing to worry about. Just a tiny thing to cover a few upgrades. 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 I glanced around the house. The massive chandelier they had installed last month suddenly looked a lot more sinister. The ridiculous high-end espresso machine. The new furniture. The renovations that I hadn't agreed to. I could feel the blood draining from my face. So let me get this straight, I said, my voice eerily steady. You took my money, bought a house, took out a mortgage against it without telling me, and then removed my name from the ownership documents? Silence. And then, my mother actually had the audacity to smile like this was all some minor misunderstanding. Maria, honey, don't be so dramatic. Oh, I was about to be dramatic. Because this wasn't just about money. This wasn't about a house. This was about trust. About the fact that the two people who were supposed to protect me, guide me, and at least pretend to have my best interests at heart had just casually committed what I was pretty sure was a crime. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. But something in me hardened in that moment. They thought they had outsmarted me. That I would just go along with it, like I always had. But they had forgotten something. I had learned everything I knew about money from my grandmother. And if my parents were expecting me to roll over and let them get away with this, they were about to be very, very disappointed. You never really expect to sue your own parents. It's not exactly something they prepare you for in school. There are no workshops on what to do when your family commits fraud against you or how to emotionally process the fact that your parents are scam artists. No one sits you down and says, hey, if your mom ever removes your name from your own house and takes out a secret mortgage, here's a step-by-step guide on handling that situation. But here I was, sitting across from a lawyer, holding a folder of evidence that essentially boiled down to my parents stole my house, please fix this. The lawyer, let's call him Mark, because his actual name was too long and serious for a man who spent most of our meetings sighing in exasperation, flipped through the documents with the expression of someone who had seen things. Wow, he muttered, scanning yet another forged signature. This is impressively bad. Tell me about it, I said, dryly. He glanced up. You sure you want to take this to court? I mean, this is fraud, no doubt about it, but it's your family. Oh, I had thought about that. I had spent weeks thinking about that. But after all the lies, the gaslighting, the oh, sweetie, it was just a misunderstanding speeches, I had come to a simple conclusion. Family should not be an excuse for getting away with crime. Yes, I said, with absolute certainty. I'm sure. Court was an experience. I say that as someone who has sat through some deeply uncomfortable family dinners, but nothing, and I mean nothing, compared to watching my mother try to charm a judge with a story so fake it should have come with a disclaimer. My husband and I only wanted to protect our daughter, she sighed dramatically, dabbing at non-existent tears. She's so young. She doesn't understand finances. We thought we were helping. Helping. Meanwhile, my father sat beside her, nodding along like some kind of supportive sidekick, as if he hadn't actively participated in wiping my name off the documents and taking out a loan on my dime. Mark, to his credit, didn't even roll his eyes. He simply pulled out the stack of evidence we had prepared, bank statements, forged signatures, all the little details that made it very clear that this was not some innocent misunderstanding, but an actual crime. The judge, an older woman who looked like she had heard every excuse in the book, sighed and rubbed her temples. So let me get this straight, she said, in the kind of exhausted voice that suggested she had no patience for nonsense. You're telling me that you, without your daughter's consent, removed her from the property deed and then took out a mortgage against the house, which she paid for in full? My mother blinked. Well, when you say it like that. How else should I say it? The judge deadpanned. And that was pretty much the moment I knew I had won. The court ruled in my favor. The house was legally returned to me, the mortgage was dumped back onto my parents, who absolutely deserved that financial disaster, and I was left staring at them as they tried one last desperate tactic: guilt. Maria, my mother said, her voice thick with betrayal, as if she was the victim here. How could you do this to us? We're family. Family. That word again. The word they had conveniently forgotten when they decided to steal from me. I looked at her, then at my father, who was avoiding my gaze like a man who had finally realized there were actual consequences to his actions. And for the first time in my life, I felt no guilt. No doubt. Just relief. Good luck with the mortgage, I said, and walked away. For the first time, I was truly free. It took exactly 1 week after the trial for my parents to start their next act. First, there were the messages, long, guilt-laden paragraphs about how hurt they were, how I had destroyed our family, how they were only trying to do what was best for me, a hilarious choice of words, given that what they had actually done was fraud. When that didn't work, the tone shifted. You'll regret this, Maria, my mother texted one evening. You don't turn your back on family. Yes. The fast and furious defense. Because nothing says family like financial deception and forgery. I ignored them. Completely. I didn't respond, didn't pick up their calls, didn't engage with the theatrics. I knew how this game worked. If I gave them even a sliver of attention, they would use it as an opening to manipulate me back into their world of debt-fueled delusions. And I was done playing their games. So I focused on what mattered, figuring out what to do with the house. Technically, I could have kept it. It was, after all, legally mine again, and there was a part of me that wanted to lounge in the living room, sip cheap wine from one of my mother's fancy glasses, and bask in the victory of reclaiming what was stolen. But every time I walked through the halls, all I saw were reminders of their lies. The overpriced furniture they had insisted on buying, the ridiculous chandeliers, the echoes of their voices convincing me that this was our home, when in reality, it had only ever been a scheme. I didn't want to live in a place haunted by their bad decisions. So I sold it. I sold the hell out of it. The market was decent, and after a few negotiations, where I may or may not have exaggerated how peaceful and harmonious the neighborhood was, I managed to offload the house at a solid profit. And for the first time since inheriting my grandmother's money, I felt like I was in control of it. Which is probably why I did something my parents would have found completely incomprehensible. I didn't spend it on myself. I donated most of it. Not in a reckless, let's make a grand gesture way, but in a way that actually mattered. I found a foundation that supported research into rare diseases, something my grandmother had cared deeply about, and made a contribution in her name. And the funny thing? It didn't feel like a loss. It didn't feel like throwing money away. It felt like the first real investment I had ever made. Not in a house. Not in status. But in something real, something that didn't come with hidden mortgages or forged signatures. As for my parents, well, word got around that they were struggling. Turns out, when you lose access to your daughter's inheritance and are left with a mortgage you definitely can't afford, things get difficult. My mother tried to paint herself as the victim, of course, spinning tales to anyone who would listen about how cruel and ungrateful I was. But the thing about living beyond your means is that sooner or later, reality catches up. And me? I moved on. I got my own place, not big, not flashy, but mine. Paid for with my money, in my name, without anyone trying to convince me it was a family investment. For the first time in my life, I had no debts. No obligations. No strings attached. Just freedom. And that was worth more than any house ever could be.